You are the goddess of wisdom.
Oh my
Well,
God, that's very kind of you.
I don't know whether Diana needs any more introduction, but just to start, she's a 2016 scholar, currently attending school at Princeton. She's originally from Southern California. And when she was in high school, she started an organization called Letters for Strangers, which is focused on bipolar disorder and rapidly grew to the point where she's got over 35,000 people involved in that in multiple countries. We're all very impressed with her background in this area, and we're looking forward to hearing what Diana has to say. So, Diana, take it away. Tell us how you got here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, so basically, I guess I should start at when I was about 9 years old. So I was born in China and I grew up in a rural village. My family is from the poorest province of China, and we are an ethnic minority there. So we lived in our own ethnic minority autonomous zone. It's a beautiful place with lots of incredible steep mountains, and those steep mountains kept us from the Han Chinese for a very long time until maybe about the 1700s when there was a big insurrection, and then we became what we are today. But I mentioned this because I think my culture has played a big part of my background as well as my mental health journey. So when I was about 9 years old, my family and I emigrated to the U.S. and I like to say we had two things working against us. First being that my parents didn't speak English, and to this day, they still don't. I will have to give credit to my mom. She has tried very hard and she's gotten much better now. So she's like decently okay, like at very basic conversations. But my dad is leaves a lot to be desired. But yeah, the other thing we had against us was that, like a lot of immigrants, we decided to start afresh in a new country here to chase that American dream. So we sold everything we owned back home. The year happened to be 2007, and then the recession hit. And so with it, we lost everything. So as I was growing up in this sort of environment, one of the things that I became very acutely aware of was the prominence that scars played in my life. I don't like to go into too much detail about it, but essentially this was something that over time made me realize and ask myself if I didn't deserve the air that I breathed, and if perhaps the only thing that is good that I can do is to essentially disappear, so that those who I felt I was being a burden to, the space I felt like I was taking up undeservedly, that would be returned back to what it should be. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 13 years old, and I survived a series of suicide attempts. And my final one, I was 14, and my little brother was the one who found me. So my little brother is someone who I practically raised as my own child, given my family situation. And I went to all his parent teacher conferences. He called me mom. I was his emergency contact. That's how it was. So when that happened, I had like this sort of breaking point in my life where I felt like no matter how dark my world got, I could not drag him down with me. So that's when I was trying very desperately to try to heal. But as you know, the American healthcare system is not easy to navigate, especially when you are in a family that doesn't speak English and you are living below the poverty line. So I ended up turning to writing, and I wrote these letters to strangers. And as I was writing these letters, I started to ask myself why I was, being so kind and empathetic to these people I'd never even met, but then I couldn't do the same for myself. And that sort of kickstarted for me this journey of self-discovery, healing, and recognizing that I had a voice and a story worth telling. So as my healing journey continued, that's sort of my inspiration for why I started Letters to Strangers as a high school club in my sophomore year of high school. Dorothy, who is Maddie's freshman year from Stanford roommate, and who happened to be my high school best friend, was one of the people who, joined us from the very start. And she was actually my vice president. So this is all very serendipitous. So, yeah. So crazily, here's the thing. Like when I first started the club, I had to like bribe my friends with pizza to come to the lunch meetings because nobody wants to do anything without free food when you're a teenager. But then like eventually people came without the pizza, and then people from other schools wanted to join. And so then we started to grow in a way that I never thought we would. And that's how sort of slowly but surely, today we are the largest global youth for youth mental health nonprofit. We are a full-on 501c3 destigmatizing mental illness and increasing access to affordable and quality treatment, with over 35,000 people in our network in over 20 countries. And we have 2 physical offices in Africa, over a dozen city chapters in India, partnerships across all sorts of other locations, and chapters, aka student-run branches on campuses in communities across all regions of the US. So this is sort of my background, how I got here, but I will say that my health background is very I don't want to, it's kind of interesting, I suppose, because around this time was also when I was diagnosed with anterior uveitis, which is an eye disease that made my eyes go blind every time that I got an episode. And the blindness would just be very random. Like nobody knew what was causing it. I like went to hundreds of specialists and did so many tests, and nobody found the reason. And every time it came, it might like last for a few days, it might last for a few weeks. And then we weren't sure if that time, like if the medicine might just not work anymore. And then that would be the last time I ever could see. And funnily enough, sometimes when I had to go to the hospital, Dorothy would run the meetings instead of me for Letters to Strangers. But yeah, that was something that like, has played a big role in my life as well, with my mental health journey, because it turned out a few years ago that I was meeting with I was at a conference, and then this Vietnamese American ophthalmologist came up to me and asked me if I thought about whether my eye disease could be psychosomatic, aka a physical manifestation of psychological distress. And I had never thought about that before. I always thought of it as like, oh, well, that's like maybe if you were like John in Sherlock and you had a limp from PTSD, but your leg was fine. But like after we discovered that, like, you know, and I started to around the same time started to really have a rounded and consistent therapy sort of treatment and medical treatment for my mental illness. Like from that point on to now, it's been 3 years and I haven't had a single eye episode, which is insane because I spent like 50% of my high school career just in and out of hospitals. So that I think is a huge component driving me forward for better access to care as well, especially in underserved communities, because it turns out that this sort of psychosomatic symptom is more likely to occur in minority cultures where the stigma is extra strong and you have maybe an extra emphasis on the mind-body connection. So that's a overview of how I got to where I am with my mental health stuff.
Great. Thank you, Diana. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions. And again, since we've got a very small group, if you want to ask a question or start a discussion topic, just jump in. But when you're not talking, please keep yourself on mute so we don't have any background noises or echoes coming. Thanks.
I got a question. Diana, what question, I'm sure you've spoken to audiences before, what question are you grateful for? And you think, oh, I'm so glad they asked that.
That's such a nice question. Can I say this one? No, but I think I really appreciate the ones where people are asking for actionable items that they can do to help mental health in their own communities. So like I like to give certain tips that I think, okay, here's the thing. I have to give a little context here. I think we're getting to the point now where as a society, we're more open to talking about mental health as a topic, but that openness is not necessarily followed up with education or an active effort to destigmatize some of the myths surrounding mental illness. So the more that we mention these buzzwords like depression and bipolar disorder without giving the context for them, it can actually lead to some problematic instances where I've had students come up to me and tell me that like now in their high school, being depressed or whatever else is almost trendy. Yeah. And that they feel like now, you know, depression is actually something that everybody has. So now the next trendy thing is bipolar disorder and who knows what's going to be after that.
Right.
And so that's something that I really try to fight against by making sure that I give out actionable tips when I talk about mental health. So for example, firstly, like ensuring that everybody understands that seeking, therapy or other sorts of mental health preventative care it's valid regardless of whether or not you have or need a diagnosis. It's just like how we go see the physical doctor for the general practitioner for a checkup for physical health. We need to like normalize seeking it as a preventative action rather than as like being something that we need to justify with the diagnosis. Another thing is watching our language, like rather than saying commit suicide, saying died by suicide instead. Commit has a sort of criminal, connotation to it, and you don't say someone committed cancer. Similarly, we say, completed suicide rather than succeeded in suicide, and it's not a success. Another thing is this is a little bit more nuanced, but like instead of saying depressed people or bipolar people, saying instead people with depression or people with bipolar disorder, sort of placing a distance between using that as an adjective to describe them as like a defining characteristic versus just something that maybe they're living with but does not define them. So those are some of the things. And then another thing I often mention is like, especially when we're talking about, let's say, suicide in our communities or as like a news reporter or, documentary maker, for example, to try to stay away from explicitly discussing the means of suicide. We see an increase, especially in copycat suicides that happen in clusters among young people because they share a lot of the same news sources, same friend groups, etc. And sometimes when people are in a very bad state of mind, having knowledge of how someone else died by suicide can serve as inspiration in the worst of ways. So those are some of the situations that I like to, point out specific action items for. I hope that like answers your question. It wasn't too long a ramble.
No. I have about 20 other questions as a result of that. So
I would love to hear about letters to strangers, how that works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so letters to strangers, we offer basically three main ways of action. The first is our anonymous handwritten letter exchanges, which is kind of our namesake. So a lot of times these happen between student-led chapters where they write letters anonymously and then exchange them randomly anonymously with each other or with like a third-party organization that they partner with. And these letters are often based on themes and guiding questions that we draw from art therapy techniques. We also created an online letter exchange platform that's free for people to use. We launched it right as COVID hit, since people seem to need that a lot more. And we've seen a huge, increase in the number of users on it around the world. Like literally, I was talking with it's completely run by youth and was coded by students who are studying computer science. And I was talking with the computing team and they were like, Diana, I think we need to upgrade our server storage plan because there's way too many letters right now. So, it's something that we try to do. But the second action that we take is our science-based peer education curricula. So I don't have a copy of it with me since I'm on campus, but we launched the world's first Youth for Youth mental health guidebook, which I posted in the Presidential Scholars group before. It's like this 80,000 word A to Z, really intersectional focused dive into mental health. And it's written entirely by 14 to 21-year-olds from over 50 countries and reviewed by medical and industry professionals. And it's free to download in black and white online. So we try to sell it as physical copies when people can't buy it so we can get some, income. But we do want to make sure it's an accessible resource for people. And then last but not least is our grassroots policy-based advocacy. So looks like chapters may be advocating for their school campuses to bring on more diverse counseling staff or doing letter campaigns to their local legislators, etc.
So adding to that, because it's by definition letters to strangers, so it's not like you're saying, oh, I'm going to write a letter to my friend Bob over here. How did you pick the first stranger to write to, and why strangers versus, I guess that's what I'm trying to I'd be curious how that started with that idea of I'm going to write to a stranger and how you selected those and how people then become a stranger. If they feel like they want to be a part of it, how it goes through. You said you now partner with different groups, but I'm thinking the back before that.
Yeah. Also, by the way, if you guys see me looking in the corner, it's because there's a bug on my wall and I'm trying to monitor it so that it doesn't land in my coffee. Yes, I'm drinking coffee at 8:21 p.m. Don't mind me. Yeah, it's midterms week. But anyway, yeah. So your question, yes, sorry, I got distracted by the bug again. But basically, so the reason why I started writing letters to strangers myself was because when I found out about my diagnosis, I had a lot of self stigma, and my own family was telling me that, like, this is something that I need to just get over, and that I'm clearly just being ungrateful and spoiled and disrespectful. So I didn't feel like I could really talk to anybody in real life about this, and that's why I ended up writing to a stranger. Like, the idea of writing to someone who could be like a friend who understands me, like, it was more tangible than just writing to nothing. So that's kind of how I got to that point. And the reason why we continued with it this way is because I think a lot of times we have things we want to say, but that we feel restricted by the way we think the reader might respond. And the way we think the reader might respond is very much correlated with how well we know the other person. So when we have to write to a stranger, we have a little bit more freedom in what we choose to say and how we want to frame our lives. But what that freedom also means is that when you're providing context for this stranger to understand your story a little bit better, you have the chance to now, put forth your story in the way that makes most sense to you, rather than in a predefined way that maybe you feel like has been defined by others for you your whole life. So one thing that I think people get a little bit confused by, which is totally understandable, is that they think we have these strangers be like pen pals that write to each other back and forth. It's actually not that. It's more of a one-time exchange. So some of our chapters still like to have the strangers actually write to each other, like in response, but then most of our chapters actually have it be that people just submit theirs to like a stranger randomly, and then they get a letter back that someone else submitted. So it's not necessarily in response to the letter they sent out.
And adding to it, so are they anonymous? Like, do you sign your letter Diana and it goes to somebody and they know it's Diana? It's just, here's a letter to stranger one from stranger two.
Yeah, it's just, one of our guiding like rules is you start with dear stranger and you end with like love a stranger, or sometimes people are like from your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man or something, Yeah.
Okay, cool. Interesting.
So I have a question. Is that okay? I don't exactly know how to craft this question, so let's talk about me, shall we? So I've spent my entire career studying gifted kids, and that's why I studied the Presidential Scholars. And I don't exactly know how to ask this in a way that'll be comfortable for you, but I'm going to try anyway. A lot of the gifted kids I've worked with over the years who are either depressed or suicidal, or families of kids who have been suicidal and succeeded at their attempt, get the line, "You're so gifted, you're so smart, you should have been able to figure it out." Do you come across that much in your work? That, I mean, it is a bias that people have. And I don't know if you've experienced it yourself or whether you've heard about that. And then the corollary to that is, when you have strangers, do you have, a gifted kid describing being depressed might have trouble articulating it in a way that average kids wouldn't understand. You don't, I mean, it's sort of a tricky question, right? So does any of that sing to you at all? And if not, that's okay. I know it's a weird question,
No, absolutely. It's a very good question. And also, I totally do not mean to like put you on blast here. So please take this in the gentlest way possible.
I do.
But I will say, you mentioned succeeded in suicide. And I think that's one of the things that like we try to like, keep mind of, right? Because it's so ingrained in the way that we talk, but to just be more mindful of the way that we talk about it.
Okay, thank you. I don't take that badly at all.
No problem at all. So yeah, okay. Basically, I think I will say, I'll add on real quick that there's a corollary as well to the questions you mentioned, which is, oh, well, don't you think that perhaps your mental illness gave you like maybe creative abilities or emotional, like, connections that allowed you to succeed at the level that you are today, which is something that people have asked me before. And all these questions are tough for sure, but I think that's one of the reasons why we try to write letters to strangers, is like because the other person doesn't know you, there's not that presumption that you have to justify why you might be feeling this way.
Yeah.
And then another thing with like, I did this exercise for myself when I was in high school, which is I was trying to see if I should write a letter to like a friend, because I was feeling this was when I was still like experiencing suicidal thoughts. And I was trying to explain why I was feeling this way, but then I kept on like deleting things, but I didn't know, like you said, like how to talk about it, given that I was kind of from a context where people look to me as a smart kid or whatever else. And then I realized that as I just took away the name and I just like, okay, I'm just going to write this to some random person, it made it a lot easier. Because a lot of the ways that we find it difficult to talk about it is also because we have that self-stigma. And I think just like the whole stranger situation helps with that.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Thanks. Yeah, in a really great way. Yeah, thank you.
I'll hop in here, I guess. I do have a question related to what you just said. I actually just very recently got a diagnosis on something, and it was like, it did feel like a very like big life-changing event to be like, okay, finally, like some things, it's like puzzle pieces are starting to align a tad for me, is like how I'll speak in I terms. That's how I started to feel about it. But I definitely experienced also some statements to that effect of like, oh, well, there's no way that could be going on with you if you've gotten this far and you've done these things or whatnot, right? And I know you mentioned like even the questioning of like, oh, well, don't you see all the benefits of what that thing maybe has done for you, right? Like you said that in that statement, and that's something that I've been feeling a lot lately, and I'm wondering how you've like maybe dealt with that internally and externally. I'm not even sure what to say to something like that, and then it's hard for me not to like ruminate on commentary like that.
For sure. And thank you for sharing that. I'll share with you what I told the person who asked me this, because they were like, there's been so many cases where, we see that if someone has a mental illness, then perhaps in those bursts of like a bipolar manic episode, they have so much more creative ability and energy. And maybe Van Gogh wouldn't have created XYZ if he wasn't mentally disturbed or whatever else. And I'm like, listen, you remember these people's names because they're one in like millions. Most people who get to the point where they are having such like, serious disruptions in their life from their mental illness, they might not make it. You don't hear their names because they are literally gone. Okay. So I was like telling this person, like, I was like, yeah, maybe my manic episodes allow me to have energetic bursts that can create things. But is that worth it? Like, is the trade-off for my success my happiness? I don't think so. I don't think that should be the situation. So that's something I try to, think about. And another thing is like, people tend to like, I think sort of similar to your point is that, and also to Felice's point, where when you hear in the aftermath of a suicide that someone who died is someone who is considered very gifted, you often hear people near them being like, oh, like we never saw this coming. They had so many successes under their belt, etc. And it's like, the thing is, the more you like reinforce this like idea that this person is XYZ and that their defining characteristic is XYZ, the more they feel like they cannot break out of that XYZ. I had a psychology teacher in high school who, after I came public with my diagnosis, she was like, oh, I never knew you had depression. Like you always seem so happy. I was like, she was a psychology teacher for teenagers. So you would think she, of all people, would like notice something. So it's very much like we have our own biases in that, and knowing that if other people project that bias onto you, that's not a reflection of your own faults.
Right.
So you mentioned seeing a huge ramp up this last year in the letters. Have you seen a change in the tone or tenor in light of COVID and the lockdowns? Have you seen kind of a shift in what people are expressing or what they're feeling and how they're expressing it?
Yeah, people are definitely mentioning COVID a lot and the sort of isolation related ruminations that they've sort of spiraled into sometimes. But I think also we see an increase in people trying to be more grateful for things, especially when you hear about like the like if somebody near them passed away from COVID or some other tragedy struck, I think they're noticing more that like life is really so fragile. So it goes both ways.
Can I ask another question? I hate hogging the scene here. Is that okay? Sorry. This is actually a procedural question. I'm curious about your staff and what happens when you get information or a call. At what point do you think, oh man, this is way beyond us? Let's call like a psychiatrist or something. Do you have a procedure for that? And if so, I'm just curious to know what it is. Do you have psychiatrists on staff or medicine people? That's all.
That's a super great question. So I used to be
here, man, that's great.
Yeah, I used to be a counselor for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline and the Crisis Text Chat, and a lot of the procedures that we use are similar to theirs. Basically, for all of the letters that are submitted online, we have a moderation team, and all letters have to be moderated first before they can be exchanged. Yeah, and then the letters are anonymous, but we do have the email addresses associated with the account if we need to like track someone down. And then also, this is kind of not really fun fact, but kind of fun fact, is that for our chapters, if they like have a situation where they are in an they think there's an emergency and they don't know what to do, like they can always call me. Like I'm the one who's on call 24/7. And so I've had situations where like maybe an India chapter called me at like 4 a.m. in the morning and they're like, Diana, I'm worried about this person. What should I do? And then, we figure it out. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a referral base of people who help? I mean, that you can call anywhere in the world, or is that? I used to be attached to the world of psychiatry, so I'm very familiar with the Child Mind Institute and like that. So I'm just wondering about, I'm really interested in what you're doing. I'm ready to volunteer now. But,
thank you.
But I'm just curious how this works.
Right. So most of the time, we've never had a situation where the person was at imminent harm, a risk of harm to themselves or others around them. And that's the sort of situation we would define as a crisis. But if a crisis were to happen, if it was in the US, we would first try to see if they had a mobile crisis team in their area. We want to try to avoid calling the police when possible. Yeah. And this is something that we've put into our guidelines like long before the BLM protest, but I think just became more apparent as to why that's necessary afterwards. We also have several psychologists and psychiatrists who are volunteer consultants for us. And then for international chapters, most of them have like a psychiatrist or psychologist that they work with. But then if they don't, before they start a chapter, we always make sure that they have a list of resources they can reach out to in the case of an emergency. So
that's great.
So we've got a few people on here who haven't asked questions yet, and I just wanted to make sure they had an opportunity. No pressure or anything.
That's because I'm hogging everything. Sorry.
I see Kath's been on here, and Maggie, who's been paying wonderful attention, and John Knox just recently joined us. So anyone else have some questions for Diana?
I have a question. This is Kathy McHale.
Awesome, thank you.
Is there some sort of matching that you do when you group meets and they have letters that have been written in deciding who will receive which letter? Do you try to find a letter that will be helpful to the person that's going to be receiving it? Or is it more like a random kind of matching?
It depends. Sorry. But yeah, so for like our online exchange, because of the sheer volume, it is randomized. We also have like trigger warnings that our moderators as well as the letter submitter can like tag their letters with, just so people know. But for our in-chapter exchanges, some chapters do take the time to sort of match a person with like a letter that they think they should receive. And then also with COVID, we launched a sub program called the COVID-19 Letters Collective, where we curate letters for bundles to like deliver to various partner organizations. So that part is like a more curated aspect as well.
Thank you.
Can you guys hear me now? Okay, yeah, sorry. Weird things were happening with my computer, hence why I left. I've been like mulling over how to ask this question for like the last 10 or 15 minutes. But I think what's really remarkable about your work, Diana, is that you have sort of, you've achieved so much yourself, but you've also been able to give so much to others, despite sort of everything that you have been through with your own sort of mental health like journey. And I'm curious about like for those who, and you mentioned earlier the idea of like Van Gogh being the sort of one in a million who is like recognized for something that he might have been able to do in like a bout of mania. What do you in that in a similar vein, what would you say to someone who looks at you and says like, oh, she's like the exception, I'll never be able to like achieve the same sort of recovery, if you want to call it that, let alone like do something so extraordinary? What would you say to that?
Oh, that question hit me hard. A few years ago I got this email from like this 14-year-old girl who was a adoptee from China who was adopted by white parents in San Francisco, and she was telling me about how like she had felt so afraid of her heritage and all sorts of stuff and her own mental illness. And then when she read my story, she was very inspired. And then over the past few years, as I got to know her more and more, she became a volunteer with us. She's been voicing a lot of the same thoughts that you just mentioned, where she's often like, Diana, I feel like I will never be able to achieve what you've done. I'll never be able to get past this. And I might not have those situations as often as I used to, where I think like maybe this is going to be the life I lead, like this being the mental illness, that this is going to be the life I have to lead for the rest of my existence. But I still have moments when like I'm taking my medication and then I'm thinking, wow, this one pill has so much control over my life. Thinking about if I stop taking it, what would that mean for who I am and what I've achieved? But I think what I try to tell people, and also myself in these situations, is that you never really know where life can lead, right? And like when I attempted and I survived, I could have like never imagined that this would be the life that I lead now. And similarly, if someone feels like they don't really see a way to get to a better place than they are at now, that's no guarantee that they actually won't be able to get there. Of course, that might sound a little bit too optimistic than someone might feel like they can believe. But at the same time, the very fact that there's that desire, that there's that hope for things to be better, there's that, want for change, that in and out of itself is so human and speaks volumes about a person's autonomy, about a person's ability to control their life, even when they feel like they don't have the control over it. And I think when you have those thoughts, when anyone has those thoughts, that in and out of itself is a sign that you are capable of making the change you want to see, even if you don't feel like it right now. I don't think we give ourselves enough credit. So that's what I try to say to others and my own self as well.
Another unrelated question. Thank you for that, by the way. I'm really interested in your perspective on culturally competent mental health care and the idea of like mental health and mental illness as being very Eurocentric, white, Western, whatever term you want to use. How have you tried to address that as part of Letters to Strangers, or what do you think is sort of the appropriate approach in general?
Yeah, that's super good question, super important. So fun fact, the DSM, the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use to diagnose mental illness, in it, the only place you find culture-bound syndromes, aka symptoms that are associated with like a particular culture, and by particular culture, usually it's a quote-unquote minority or exotic culture. These symptoms and syndromes are relegated to the appendix of the DSM, which means for the most part, the way that we diagnose mental illness is based on and written by white people for white people. And the issue with this is that a lot of modern day psychiatry and psychology knowledge that are, practiced in non-Western places were brought there by Western like doctors, etc. In China, for example, where my family is, if you want to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, you must go to the Western medicine sector of the hospital, not the traditional Eastern sector. And so with this comes a lot of issues, right? Where, like you said, like sometimes these symptoms are not necessarily representative of how a particular culture might manifest their own concerns. This was the case for me when I had my eye disease. It took an Asian American ophthalmologist to be able to tell me that maybe it's something related with my mind. So with Letters to Strangers, the reason why our guidebook is so freaking thick is because we were very, very keen on making sure that we talked in depth about culturally sensitive and nuanced mental health concerns. So rather than like, okay, if you look up on Google right now, like literally you can do this like right now. If you're like, oh, Asian American mental health or Black American mental health, you'll find lots of websites that have like a 1-page little overview on things, and then that's it. So we were like, no, this is so much more nuanced and, you know, diverse than that. So that's something we try to do. And with the guidebook, we try to be a little international with it. So like, for example, we also have like sections on religious and gender/sexual and also socioeconomic diversity. We're launching a YouTube series in the next few months that's more American racial focused, but it goes in depth into how different racial minorities in the US might experience mental health in different ways, as well as some of the cultural backgrounds and historical backgrounds that led to those situations. So that's all going to be free resources that I'll be happy to share if you're ever interested.
I think Kay was going to say something.
This is all just so amazing and astounding, and I'm just so impressed with what you've done for the world and for young people all across our country and beyond. What was your process as you began writing? I'm fascinated because I've been thinking about the idea of fixed mindset and how we get this idea of who we are at such a young age, and we're often limited before we have a chance to define who we are, you know, and I think this Letters to Strangers gives you that opportunity because your both ends are being anonymous, and so therefore your mind is free to really explore your inner voice, your subconscious, as you will. And I wondered for you personally, as you began writing these letters, if you could talk a little bit about what that process was for you of going from feeling very perhaps isolated and afraid to being empowered to then go on and help the world.
I think it's a slow process. I mean, like I had mentioned before, where like, you know, when I started Letters to Strangers, I never thought it could grow to what it was today. Like I literally thought it was going to be a stupid little club that like my friends will feel like coerced into, and then once I graduate, it's just going to disappear into thin air. Like literally, I tell people, like when I applied for college, I like didn't even list Letters to Strangers because I was all like, this is not even going to be a thing. Like, and then the thing is, like, I realized over the years that as people found us online and reached out about like, you know, starting their own chapter, etc., that this is something that holds a lot more meaning than what I had given it credit for. So I think actually the process of letter writing is complemented by the process of this organization resonating with people. Those two elements combined made me start to feel like, okay, maybe I do have the ability to be like somebody who does something. Maybe this is not all stupid. Yeah, and then another thing is like with the writing letters is like I love writing poetry, but I think sometimes like people think my poetry is a little how do I say this, too metaphorical. So and like, you know, with writing letters you sort of force yourself to have to provide contextualizations for things, and also when you're writing to a stranger, it's like if you're writing in your diary and you're writing about something that's really bothering you, maybe you'll end on like a very bad note and then you just spiral into like a very sad, negative bunch of emotions. But when you're in a conversation with somebody else, you almost feel like a little bit of a social pressure where you're like, I don't think I should just like leave them with like, and I hate everything and I'm going to destroy everything, things like that. And I'm like, it's almost as if when you're watching a movie, like you feel very unsatisfied if the ending is just like, and so with the process of writing the letters, he almost forced me to, as I'm like coming to the end of like another rambling thought, to think about, well, okay, how can I close this out? And I'm not like trying to force like a fake sense of like optimism when I don't feel like it, but more so just, well, maybe I can recognize that, there are other parts to this that I might not be giving as much attention to as I could. And those parts might actually be kind of good. So that helped a lot too.
And then you said something earlier about you were speaking to someone more kindly than you speak to yourself. And I'm so fascinated by that as well, because, you hear about write a letter to your inner child and things like that, and that it's used so much that it almost feels like a cliche. But then when you try it, it's kind of nice because you speak to a child differently than you speak to yourself. And I wonder what that was like for you, like that process of like, oh, I'm speaking to them so nicely and they're exactly like me, whatever,
Yeah, that was a huge part too, because like, a lot of my inner dialogue was very negative. But then like when I was writing to like a stranger, it's not like I can be like, you know what, everything sucks. There's no hope in this world. That's just, I'm like, yeah, I can be that pessimistic, but I want to like, do that to other people. And so as I'm writing this stuff, I'm like, well, maybe I should listen to my own advice. Look at that, I think it sort of helped instigate a sort of inner dialogue change. And that was very helpful because you can have other people in your life tell you like, oh, well, why don't you think about it this way? But then like, when people tell you what to do, you're kind of like, it's more effective if you instigate that from within. So. Yeah. Also, John, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was. This is fascinating. I'm sorry I was late. I was actually teaching a class. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia.
You're a geo professor, right?
What?
You're a geoscience professor, right?
Well, that's a whole other thing I want to talk to you about, right? But that's later. So when I was in graduate school, I just fell deep into clinical depression, really bad. And nothing I did with a therapist one-on-one worked. But what did work for me pretty well was being in a group, being in a men's group, where what happened was my empathy would kind of get focused on other people and it would kind of untangle the snarl. I think of depression as like a snarl, where you get all tied up together and very in focus on yourself, really tight on it. So what I wanted to know, and you may have already covered this, is how did you hit on the idea of writing not diary notes to yourself, but letters to strangers? Because the whole empathy thing seems to be, in my personal experience, just essential part of it to get out of the focus. So how'd you hit on that? Or if you already explained, everybody can say, oh, she already told us that.
No, like, thank you. That's like kind of just a quick note on that is one of the things I did a few years ago was I was interviewing people in San Francisco about their mental health journeys. And I became friends with this one guy who's, due to his bipolar disorder and also drug addiction, he's been in and out of the streets of downtown Berkeley as a homeless person for like 19 years. And I was like talking with him one day and he was like, Diana, I just want to be well enough to help somebody else. Uh-huh. And that really stuck with me. And one thing I always say to people now, whenever they're like, oh, well, I've been trying to help like, my sister or my family member about getting to help, like getting to find help. And then they're like refusing to. And I'm like, why don't you flip it around and ask them to help you with something? It could be something very simple. And you could even make it kind of funny. Like, oh, I've been trying to talk to this person person and I think they might be interested in me, but I'm not really sure. What do you think I should do? But like something to give them that sense of autonomy and independence back, to feel like they're not just someone who's lost and subjected to like this illness, but someone who has ability to take direction in their life. And that is kind of where I hit on the idea of writing letters to strangers, was because I used to write all sorts of journal entries, but I found that I was like, it was almost feeding into like my negative spirals.
Yes.
And I know like it can be really helpful for a lot of people, but it just was not working for me. And so literally one day I was like so annoyed. And so in my journal, I was just like, dear, like whatever. And I was like, you know what? And then as I finished writing it, I was like, oh, hey, that was not so bad. And that's kind of just, how it went from there.
That's great. And it might not be true for a lot of people, but I really resonate with the idea that part of the partial cure, it's not a cure, but part of the partial cure is to be able to focus on others. So that as soon as I read about your program, I thought I gotta make it to this event. So anyway, thank you for what you're telling, and we'll connect on the geoscience stuff later.
I'm curious why geoscience for you, Diana. I mean, John's amazing. I tell stories about his knowledge all the time, but how did you become interested in geoscience? Sciences.
That's a great question that I am also being asked by every single job interview, like recruiter. Because they look at my resume, and then they look at my major, and they're like, "This does not compute." But yeah, okay. So basically, I went into college as a physics major. I used to do a lot of like science stuff. Like this is a big reason also why I thought Letters to Strangers wasn't gonna like stick, because I felt like I couldn't really pursue anything in this field. It just seemed like I'm sure you've heard of like Asian parent expectations. My parents were not like that, but I still had that immigrant feeling of like, I need stability in my life. So I was like, science and physics. And then I took a physics class at Princeton and I was like, nope. So I got bulldozed. So then I was like, okay, well, I still need to do something sciencey. Like I didn't even give myself the option to think otherwise. So I was like, what can I do that's sciencey, but also kind of tangible and doesn't just feel like I'm trying to solve math equations all day for some theoretical random thing. And so I landed on climate change and climate science. And then Princeton doesn't have a like specific earth science or atmospheric science department. So they group all the geology, paleontology, climate science, everything into one geosciences field. So then I ended up here.
You might want to try University of Georgia.
Princeton's a really great program. Did I see your advisor is Michael Oppenheimer? Is that?
Yes, he is.
Yeah, a very famous name in environmental work.
Yeah, he's my thesis advisor. But if you asked him, he would be like, "What? I'm advising Diana because I haven't heard from her in like 2 months." Oops.
So what do you want to do with your geosciences degree? Where you talked about the interview process, what direction are you hoping to head with it?
Yeah, so I'm still planning on, working on Letters to Strangers at least for a few more years before I age myself out and have like some of the younger folks take over. But I'm pretty okay with doing that like in my off time, quote unquote. So I'm looking for jobs right now, and I've been applying to like all sorts of random health related stuff, which is why everybody's been super confused about my geo degree. But it's fine. I am, it's what it is. But also I will say that a big thing I try to think about is that, I think there's going to be an ever growing intersection between climate science / climate change and mental health, especially because, okay, so I mentioned before, I'm an ethnic minority and we're considered the indigenous people of my province, which is why we have our own autonomous zone in China. And for me, like a big focus has been, fighting for indigenous rights amidst growing climate change issues because of the disproportionate health impacts. Especially like you see situations where, for example, in the Inuit language, the word health includes within its definition your environmental health, which means if your environment is unhealthy, no matter how physically or mentally healthy you might otherwise be, you would define yourself as unhealthy. And you also see like, as these with climate change, you see, habitats change, which means your perhaps previous traditions or, customs, the festivals that go with harvest seasons or specific animal, harvesting techniques. These things become more and more obsolete, and that can lead to a sense of like a loss of cultural community, cultural identity, etc., that can hit really hard on populations that have already been colonized and went through genocide and lost so much already. And one really interesting statistic I'll mention here, which also is mentioned in our guidebook, is that in the 1990s, there was a indigenous village in Alaska. It's called Kake, K-A-K-E. Anyway, they had one of the highest youth suicide rates in the entire nation. And for a few years, after that statistic came out, one of the tribal elders started this program where every summer he would sort of teach the indigenous youths there how to go through the traditional fishing and harvesting process, how to process these food techniques, and have like this whole cultural, like custom sort of situation where they just learned about these things and got really immersed in it. And after that program started running, a decade later, the youth suicide rate in that village was 0. I'm not making this up. Like literally, like this is on NPR and stuff. Like when I heard this, I was like, there's no way, but like that was like the only big thing that had changed. And it just shows how important it is having a community and then, a sense of identity that you feel like you can claim pride in, how big of a role that plays in our mental health, and how with climate change, that's going to become ever more difficult.
It was great to hear you talk about that. It's such an important issue, and I'm actually doing some like research and reporting on it right now. So we should definitely talk about it more, probably at some other time. But I wanted to ask you whether you think the model of writing to a stranger and the openness that comes with that, whether you ever imagine that being sort of mainstream, whether you think people will be able to talk or write in that way to people they know, and like what kinds of big cultural shifts you think are necessary to create that kind of environment.
Do you mean like where writing letters to strangers can become writing letters to people you know, but it's still the same like feelings as if you were writing to a stranger?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. I don't know that we can get to that point. Like, I would love to see it, but I think especially now with the digital clout chasing that we see as more and more relevant, you get to a situation where people feel increasingly defined by their relevance, and their relevance can look like number of followers, numbers of likes, whatever else. And I think it's going to be hard to try to break free from that. In terms of like, because here's like the problem is that now you get to a situation where more and more the people who you might have used to consider as strangers are now kind of not really strangers anymore, because you can easily find them online, especially if you have a large audience, so maybe actually, now that I think about it, maybe this could go both ways, right? Where on one hand, more and more people kind of lose that status as strangers. So you're not really able to be as open and empathetic anymore because you have that sort of self-questioning of how will they perceive me if I say XYZ. But at the same time, you could also have it be that if enough people got to the point where stranger is just sort of an obsolete concept, then maybe like by definition, every letter becomes a letter to not a stranger and therefore also a stranger. You know what I'm saying? Like if the stranger definition itself is no longer there, then it doesn't matter if a person is a stranger or not. So I think this will be very interesting. We'll have to wait and see how this pans out.
And Maggie is one of our newest seed grant recipients and has a mentorship program. So I'm interested, Maggie, in you mentioning that program, and maybe there's a link between letters and mentoring, or writing and mentoring. That might be a reach.
Yeah, actually, so the idea for my project, not the one I ended up getting the grant for, but I am hoping to set up a sort of peer support network inspired by a couple of groups that I have contributed to or like come across. But the goal is sort of, it's in a sense, it's like the opposite of letters to strangers, because I think the idea is to like be connected with a stranger who, but establish a sort of long-term bond with them, and with the idea that like you don't like carry or you're not like hampered in this relationship by like whatever baggage you previously had, but had in your life, but you're sort of free to express that still. Sorry, that was like not a good explanation. But yeah, I think there definitely we can talk about this like later on. There probably is room to like collaborate.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, like, when we have the reason we have our chapter structure is so that even though you're writing letters to strangers, you're still part of a peer community that's there to support each other. And also, like, we always do a peer discussion after every in-chapter letter exchange. So there's a lot of similar elements in terms of like having a group of people you feel like you can create that bond with, who understand your story to the extent you feel comfortable telling them.
Maggie? I don't know if this is helpful to you or not, and I'm sorry to make this about me, but in 1987, I did a study of the role of mentors in the lives of presidential scholars. And the only reason I'm mentioning that to you, or Diana, to you, I don't know, is that there was a real pattern about what gifted people, i.e. presidential scholars, derived from the mentorship relationship. This is back in the days when mentorships were just being written about. I mean, I'm really old, so, but anyway, you might want to take a look at that, just because it gives a model, like one of the early models of mentorship, that maybe might be a useful paradigm for either of you to think about. There, I've said it. It was 1987, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that might be interesting.
Who knows? Who knows, right?
I wanted to ask about how you structure the themes or the topics around the letters, or do you at all? Is it just a random selection, like I'm going to write about this because I'm really thinking about this, or we're all going to address, feelings of isolation or feelings of, deep depression or despair?
Yeah. Also, I'm guessing that Matt was going to say something about how, we should wrap up soon. So I'll try to keep this short and he can say his spiel. But basically, yeah, so we always say like our themes and guiding questions are not obligatory. So people can still write about whatever they want, but we try to have more open-ended themes. So some of our themes have included the little miracles, or hope is the thing with feathers, or the sound of silence, whatever else. And then we can have like, guiding questions that can maybe extrapolate on that a little bit. And I think that helps a lot with people getting started on writing letters when they're not sure what to say. But yeah, it's not so much about like, let's talk about our mental illness, but more so these other more abstract thoughts.
And do you happen to have any of that you could share, like the letters? I mean, not the letters, the themes or the prompts. I'm starting to do a whole series of focus groups for my new movie. And part of what I'm anticipating is, because of the isolation with COVID, and some of it'll be on Zoom, or certainly with everyone wearing masks, or they'll just be writing their responses, of how to get at something on a deeper level with students that I have not been able to build this relationship with over my usual acting classes and things like that.
Yeah, you can go to letterstostrangers.org, and then on our website, we have sample letters, as well as you can access our online letter exchange platform on that website. And on our exchange platform, every month, we have a new theme with guiding questions put out on the homepage. I'll type the link in the chat, and then Matt, you can say your spiel.
Well, I don't want to shut down anything, but we do promise our guest speakers that we expect them to allow us to have their benefit of their knowledge for an hour. And it's been a little bit over an hour now. Diana, you have a choice. If you're exhausted and just maybe want to wrap things up, we could do that. If you'd like to last a little while longer, we could extend to an hour and a half if you wish. It's so up to you.
I'm happy to stay for another 25 minutes.
Okay, great. Everyone should ask away some more questions.
Oh, wait, sorry, Pam, were you saying something?
Oh, I was joking. I said, how's the bug doing? It hasn't landed in your coffee yet, has it?
Oh, dude, I forgot about it. I don't see it now. Oh, no, I'm scared.
forget I asked that.
It's okay. It's fine. I grew up in a village, man. Like this is nothing. We say if you don't have bugs in what you're eating, it's not organic enough.
I actually had a question for you, Diana. How do you feel about the increased impact of social media on everyone's lives? I mean, I know people who are absolutely obsessed with social media. And I know there's a lot of people who are now working in the trust and safety departments of social media, trying to help people who come to them or come to their attention in some way with issues. Any opinions on the social media and how that interacts with the audience you're working with?
Oh, absolutely. It plays a huge role, right? Because like social media, if we think about it, it happened so fast. Like we literally had no time to really think about ways to be educated on it, be safe with it, be regulated about it, etc. And while, of course, we see it as like, playing a huge role in connecting people during the pandemic, especially, you see that rising cyberbullying, you see the increasing body image issues, especially because now you have the technology, like even with a live video, you can completely like change the way you look with different filters and apps and things like that. Like nothing is really real anymore, but then yet our education has not caught up with that. So then we still don't really know how to discern things. So I think like, it's one thing I try to talk about when I, mention social media on the role of youth mental health is it's not the enemy, but the thing is we have to take steps towards making sure that kids are more aware of like just the small ways in which it can impact them. So for example, I like to show videos when I'm doing workshops on that, like videos of how you can literally edit a pizza into like a woman in a bikini. Like it's like insane what you can do with like Photoshop or whatever else. And then also like I tell people like, hey, if reading about my accomplishments or whatever else on my social media makes you feel, I don't know, like not worthy or just makes you feel bad about yourself, unfollow me. Like my following me is not worth the cost of you feeling like comparison is stealing your joy. So I wish more people would like, I'm not saying this as if like I'm doing something super great. I just feel like there should be like the basic minimum. But then of course you have like, the people who are trying to use social media as a currency, which I get it. Anyway, point being that I feel, it's something that's going to continuously spiral, maybe out of our full understanding of how it works and how to control it. So what we can do is like, if we are not able to catch up with the speed at which it's developing and changing, is to at least speed up our ability to retroactively teach people about the changes that have happened so that they can at least be aware of that.
Thank you. I might want to follow up with you and introduce you to Sydney Poor, who's at Wikipedia and is dealing with a lot of these issues right now. So we'll chat some other time on that.
Sounds good. Yeah. Copyright also is like a whole other issue, and fake news and everything. But then that gets way beyond the realm of mental health, right? It just seeps into every element of life.
Well, it's amazing how many people threaten to kill themselves on Wikipedia, and she deals with that on a daily basis. So, there might be some areas to learn there. So.
Yeah, actually on that, there was a news story, I think last year. It was about how there was this teenager, I think she was in middle or high school, who died by suicide. And a lot of people were like, oh, it looked like she was being severely cyberbullied. But then as they did more and more investigations behind it, it turned out that the cyberbullying accounts were made by her. As in, she was creating these other personas to bully herself. Like, it's like people, and you had people saying in the comments like, oh, it sounds like, well, maybe she wanted to get sympathy from other people who might see that she's being harassed or whatever else. And then when she maybe was not getting the support she thought she would get, maybe that made her feel like she was losing more of her worth. And then you also see this in the context of I had mentioned before, where depression and anxiety are becoming more and more buzzwords, where people think that being sad means you're depressed, and therefore everybody now has depression, and then people feel like they have to resort to more and more drastic measures to be taken seriously. And this is all just like a huge snowballing issue, right? So that's why I always say, like, with whenever I talk about like mental health stuff, even if I'm just talking about my personal story, I do try to include some elements of mental health education in there so that we can destigmatize while also being actively educated on it. I do this little exercise in my talks where people, like, I go down a list of common mental illnesses and ask people to raise their hand if they think they know what that illness entails. And then I go down the list again, but then the second time, I asked them to raise their hand only if they had learned about that illness in like a textbook or from a personal experience, from an expert, etc. And the number of hands always dramatically drops the second time around, especially for things like, psychotic disorders or personality disorders, etc., where when we do think we know what they mean, but then we don't actually, we just end up relying on media depictions that are stereotypes and can actually contribute to stigma. So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but yeah, it's an issue. Not to be a Debbie Downer, sorry.
Oh my goodness, Diana, you are just so wonderful. I'm so thrilled that you could be here with us and get to chat. I don't want to cut anyone off if others had questions, but oh my gosh, I'm just overwhelmed by how excited I am that you got to come and chat with us about such an important topic, especially right now. It just really does feel like, to all the points you were making, like in terms of people almost treating it like it's trendy to like have something going on. That's only been amplified as of late, considering this year. So it feels very timely.
So if people I'm sorry, go ahead.
I heard a lot about with young girls and cutting behavior that and also with eating disorders, that there was this whole, what are your thoughts about that, about the amount of people who are doing it because it's trendy? Or do you think that that's not really the case, that they wouldn't be doing it unless there was something really going on?
I think the fact that if they're doing it, regardless of if there was something going on before or not, the act itself is enough for us to be concerned. Yeah. But I will say, yeah, I will say, I mean, the media definitely plays a huge role. Like, two big examples I can think of. One is that when Justin Bieber, there was like a fake post going around that Justin Bieber was self-harming, and then that fake post went pretty viral among his fans, and then a lot of his young female fans started posting on social media pictures of themselves self-harming to be like, I'm in support of Justin, or whatever else. And then that's another thing I wanted, like another example I'm thinking about is like media, like the TV shows like 13 Reasons Why, which I think has good intentions, but then as you're depicting, like I mentioned before, similar with journalism ethics, where like you want to avoid explicitly mentioning means of harm. Similarly, like with shows depicting like means of suicide, or even if they're not like showing it explicitly, if they're just talking about it explicitly, that's also an issue. Like there was like a famous Asian American entrepreneur who passed. We're not sure if it was by suicide or not, but it was something related to a drug overdose. And anyway, like there was a huge article on Forbes about it, and then they mentioned the exact drug that he was taking. And so I emailed them and I was like, yo, like I know you're trying to mean well, but like you can literally find this drug on Amazon, okay? Like this is not a good way to go about it. And I think the fact that we don't have ethical regulations, or like even just knowledge about how to talk about this stuff and how to depict it, leading to a lot of well-intentioned but problematic situations like this that ends up contributing to people doing this sort of behavior. I think that's a big part of it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
One last thing, I've been actually thinking a lot about the whole binge cycle of the social media, like even Netflix, and I'm so guilty of it with a good series, just like, I've got to find out what happens next, you know, and the endless scroll and the doom scrolling, and that the act of doing that every day, particularly in the last year, creates in the brain a kind of binging mentality that it's hard to focus. And I think that's having a really big impact on mental health. I don't know if you've come across that in any of your letters or anything.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you're mentioning that as something that you personally can empathize with, because I think a lot of times we hear from, our younger folks like, oh, I feel like my parents or people who are older than me in my life just think that I'm being too dramatic when I say there's these issues I'm facing. But like, if people who have lived for a long time without having all these social media influences in their lives are finding themselves influenced by these social media things, just imagine if you're a young person who grew up with this as your only life, right? So that's yeah, I mean, definitely, like, it's a huge deal. So that's why, like, I think there's been an increasing advice saying things like, oh, maybe you should devote just an hour a day to reading the news and nothing more than that. Or sometimes you need to go on social media detox and just reset your account or block your account or whatever else. I unfollowed every person who I was following who I felt like was giving me body image issues, and just things like that, like normalizing that for yourself. Also, the bug is back, so at least it's not in my coffee.
It's CSS, the CIA or the NSA, one of those two. They're bugging us.
Got it.
All right, yay.
Oh yeah, John, I don't know if you were here when I mentioned it, but there was a bug on my wall. That's why we were talking about it.
Bugs everywhere are talking about you now.
Yeah, I figured it out. Good. So I'll make my offer. If you need any letters of recommendation, I have a standing offer with Presidential Scholars to do that sort of thing. It's one thing I can do in life. So let me know if you're applying for any jobs where you can use someone that's a geoscientist that can speak to the other side of Diana.
Thank you so much. I really might just take you up on that because I'm starting to get a little bit worried. It's mid-March and I'm like, I don't know where I'm going to be after graduation.
Well, can I ask you a question about that? Have you talked to the people at NIH about working there, NIMH?
I have not. I'll be honest with you. I'm trying to avoid working like too much in like mental health stuff. Like when I say I was looking at like health stuff, I meant like, maybe in a facet that's different from what I do now. I'm just a little bit afraid of burning myself out in the field.
Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know.
So have you been looking for jobs specifically right out of college rather than graduate school or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I might go to graduate school later on, but I think right now my main thought is if I can find something that's like has a pretty nice work-life balance, aka set hours or remote or whatever else, that can allow me to be flexible with all of my letters to strangers work and speaking stuff. I think that would be ideal. Because I don't pay myself through letters to strangers. Like the donations we get, like I use it for, if I do pay staff, it's for my team. So
getting on to the end of our time period here, any last questions or requests from anyone in the audience?
I guess I'm curious, and it may be on your website where it says this, but since you mentioned that, you are a nonprofit, where does your funding primarily come through? Just regular donations? Does it come through grants, all of the above? Just curious how you are able to keep this going because you're a college student. College students obviously don't have pockets full of money to throw at it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on a full scholarship in college. I definitely do not have pocket money. So it's really funny. Like 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I think we had like $2,000, and then now we have we don't have that much more, but we do have a lot more, like relatively, mostly through donations. I would say I was able to meet a few really wonderful recurring donors / philanthropists. Also grants. I've also been very lucky to have had like several corporate sponsors through various competitions I've entered. So I was the youngest Unilever Young Entrepreneurs Award winner. And then this past year, I was a L'Oreal Paris Women of Worth, and both of those got some nice donations. So that was nice.
Good for you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right, would you like to wrap it up and give us some final thoughts and suggestions and ideas?
Sounds good. Oh, Susan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm going to just echo what Maddie said. You are a light and a breath of fresh air for people who aren't 16 to 20, 21, 22. You've given us great information. I hope that you follow Presidential Scholars and receive the medallion. And it was nice to be able to, talk about your session. It is being recorded, and I hope you're okay with the fact that we share it, because we have a lot of people that come back later, or that we can share this with people who are not Presidential Scholars to inform them and maybe drum up some donations as well. And so I just wanted to thank you as the Interim Executive Director for the time and the thought that you've provided tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my honor and pleasure. I'm very grateful for this. Yeah, I put in the chat, by the way, a link. It's a direct link on our website towards our online letter exchange platform, which has the themes and guiding questions, and also allows anyone, regardless of if you're in a chapter or not, to submit or receive letters if you wanted to. But yeah, also if for anyone who's watching this later on who does not see the link in the chat, is letterstostrangers.org/letter-exchange. Anyway. I'm really glad and grateful that you all lent me your precious time. I hope this was semi-helpful / interesting. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm at diana@letterstostrangers.org. And yeah, I'm always proud to be a California 2016 scholar.
Good. I'll follow up with you on LinkedIn. Is that good?
Well, in that case, I would like to give a round of applause to Diana, and we love having you here for all the information. And I think I counted at least 5 different people who wanted to follow up with you later. So watch your email box.
And good luck with graduation and your job search.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I will say that I am writing my thesis right now, so please give me 24 hours to respond.
Okay. And without, I think with that, we're done for the evening. Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you so
thank
much,
you.
Anna.
Patty, Matt.
Thank you.
Diana,
Take care.
Elise, Pam, Kay,
Hi, Diana.
Maggie, John,
Yes.
Kathleen, thanks for coming.
And thank you to our organizers. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.